Growing up in small-town America, my name is Hailey Johnson. I was born on November 30th, 1983, in the heart of Greenville, South Carolina. A medium-sized town surrounded by gently rolling hills, red clay roads, and tall pine trees. Maybe it sounds cliché, but there was a kind of slow-motion beauty to my childhood, cradled by community gatherings, the scent of honeysuckle in summer, and the steady, reassuring flow of the Reedy River. My memories of home are cozy, a little bittersweet, and colored by the warmth and chaos of a large, loving family. I'm the middle child, third out of 7 kids. That probably explains both my occasional craving for attention and my knack for fading into the background when things at home got, well, boisterous. My father, Thomas Johnson, ran a family hardware store in town. He'd inherited it from his dad, who had run it from a shed behind the house until expanding to Main Street. Mom, Susan, was a full-time mother. With 7 children, her days were a whirlwind of laundry, meals, scraped knees, story time, and above all, patience. We weren't wealthy, but there was always homemade cornbread on the table, and every holiday meant family packed into our little living room, laughter echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Early on, I felt the pull of something beyond Greenville. My siblings called me the Wanderer. I was the one hunched over library atlases, papering my bedroom walls with postcards and maps. My secret wish? To someday zigzag across America, maybe even past the blue haze of the Smoky Mountains, seeing every town too small for a Wikipedia page. My parents dreamed big for us, college, good jobs, but I always quietly planned for adventure before life got too serious. When I was 8, change arrived. My father decided we would pack up and move west to Boulder, Colorado. He said it was for better schools, safer neighborhoods, and a real chance to start fresh. I think he also wanted to escape the constant repairs and relentless southern humidity. Packing up our old house was messy, a circus of cardboard boxes, teary neighbors bringing casseroles, and my mother making lists at the kitchen table for days. The drive cross-country was a wild mix of ice cream pit stops, car games, and the silence that settles in after a long goodbye. Arriving in Boulder was a shock. There were dramatic red rocks, snow-capped peaks, and people who seemed to run everywhere in neon running shoes. Our new street sat at the edge of the Rockies, with prairie dogs popping up in vacant lots and the sky stretching on forever. Boulder was famous for its independent spirit, colorful farmers' markets, and the way afternoon sunlight painted everything gold. But underneath all that scenery I found the same small-town feelings: neighbors waving, Friday night football games, people who remember your name. Growing up the rest of the way in Boulder meant learning to ride my bike up steep hills, breathing air that tasted impossibly clean, and slowly, over years, finding that the idea of home could fit more than one place. My family, sprawling, noisy, always there, kept me grounded. That restless longing for adventure, it kept growing. I'd spend summer nights lying in my new bedroom, the Rockies silhouetted through my window, dreaming of hitchhiking across the country one day, notebook in hand, a backpack full of snacks, and the American highway stretching wide and unknown before me. The dream of cross-country hitchhiking. Ever since I was a teenager, adventure stories held a powerful sway over my imagination. My head was full of tales of Jack Kerouac's wild highways, the wanderlust-filled letters of lesser-known travelers, and the headlights of dusty pickup trucks barreling west. I was captivated by the idea of seeing America up close, not through the polished lens of travel brochures but by feeling the vibrancy and unpredictability of life on the open road. Senior year, with college applications and expectations mounting, the itch for freedom became impossible to ignore. My best friend Lisa Richards was just as captivated as I was by the prospect of unplanned miles and unexpected detours. Our friendship had always been adventurous, secret hikes, late-night stargazing on the roof, but we both felt the next step needed to be something grander, a real rite of passage before adulthood reeled us in. Hitchhiking by then was no longer as romanticized as the decades before, but it still held an aura of possibility. My parents, ever cautious, would never have sanctioned such a risky mode of travel. So Lisa and I hatched a plan. We'd tell our families we were catching Greyhound buses, pooling our summer job money to fund a cross-country trek, but our real intention was to trust the wide American highway and the kindness of strangers. We spent weeks poring over maps and scouring online forums for tips, what to pack, where to find safe rides, how to recognize danger. Lisa's older cousin had hitchhiked with a friend after college, making it to the West Coast with stories that sounded half mythical and vividly real all at once. His advice became our gospel: trust your gut, never split up, and always have an exit plan. I stuffed my backpack with practical things: Water bottle, first aid kit, Swiss Army knife, and nostalgic ones too, an old Polaroid camera, a notebook for jotting down my thoughts, the shell bracelet my little sister insisted I wear for luck. There was an electricity between us as our plans crystallized. Route 66, the Pacific Coast, tiny farm towns in Nebraska, the Great Smoky Mountains. Each dot on the map was a new story waiting to be lived. We set rules for ourselves: call home every chance we could, check in by text, avoid traveling at night, and never ride with anyone who felt off for even a second. We knew the risks, all those cautionary tales whispered by older sisters and neighbors, but they felt distant, outweighed by the yearning for independence. At night I would lie awake listening to the coyotes in the foothills, and picture myself a tiny dot moving through infinite open space. The freedom, the possibility, even a little of the fear of not knowing what lay ahead, it all called to me stronger than anything else. I was determined that before I settled anywhere, before I put down roots or marched down the well-trodden path of job, marriage, and bills, I would know what it felt like to be truly, wildly free on the American road. Lisa and I chose an early July departure, when Colorado's summer was sweet with wildflowers and the air at sunrise promised anything could happen. We both knew this would be the trip that defined us, a collection of choices and chances that would either become a badge of honor or a hard-learned lesson. Either way, my dream of hitchhiking across the country had ceased to be just that, a dream. It was about to become a reality for better or worse. The journey begins, and peaceful days. The morning of July 15th felt momentous, thick with the hum of nervous excitement and summer sunlight streaming through the windows. Lisa and I, both carting oversized backpacks and crumpled maps, set out from Boulder with an eagerness that could barely fit inside the car that would bring us to the highway's edge. My mom smothered me with one last hug, fighting back tears, while Lisa's dad stuffed a handful of $20 bills into her palm, mumbling practical warnings about stranger danger and calling home every night. It hit me suddenly how much trust we were borrowing from everyone who loved us. The first stretch from Colorado into Wyoming was surreal. Each mile felt like a small victory, prairie grass flickering gold outside our windows, clouds drifting lazily above sprawling cattle fields. We stopped in Cheyenne only long enough to snap a photo by the Welcome to Wyoming sign, both of us grinning wide despite the sting from tired legs. Even the roadside diners we ducked into for greasy breakfasts felt strangely charmed, like we were already gathering stories worth retelling. Money was tight, so we jumped at odd jobs wherever we could find them. In Scottsbluff, Nebraska, we asked around at the local farmer's market and landed a couple of days picking strawberries at sunrise, the sticky sweet smell of berries clinging to our clothes. Sometimes we'd split a plate of pancakes at a small-town cafe, or spend nights camped out behind gas stations, the galaxy dizzy above us, half wondering if we'd wake to a raccoon rummaging our food. Every morning brought a new sense of freedom, and, if I'm honest, the tiniest undercurrent of fear. But with Lisa's laughter bubbling beside me and the novelty of every new town, I rarely let my worries speak out loud. Along the way we found ourselves entangled in quirky moments, an old couple in a battered RV who insisted on showing us their photo albums, an aspiring country singer we met at a truck stop who played us a tune and swore we'd hear her on the radio someday, even a high school baseball team who invited us to join a game of catch while our laundry tumbled at the local laundromat. Each encounter threaded us deeper into the patchwork of American life, a reminder that kindness could be found in the most unexpected places. Lisa and I kept to our rules. Only hitch rides during the day, check in with home whenever possible, and trust our instincts without compromise. Still, there was a reckless thrill whenever we caught sight of a thumbed ride approaching, a sense that anything could happen, good or bad. Were we too naive? Maybe. But for a fleeting stretch of July it felt like we were living on the edge of a dream, basking in the sunlight of our own daring. The miles slipped beneath our feet and every state line felt like a fresh beginning. Every morning as dew clung to our shoes and laughter rang between us, I wondered how long could this golden luck last. An unexpected stopover, and the destined destination. The morning that would unknowingly become a turning point began with nothing more remarkable than the mist lingering above the golden fields and the distant rumble of a freight train heading east. Lisa and I had spent the previous night camped under a vast Montana sky, swapping stories and carefully rationing the last of our peanut butter. I remember even now the way the sunrise painted Lisa's hair copper and made everything, every hope, every risk, seem possible. We'd made it to a small town called Harper's Springs after hitching a ride with an amicable farmer and working a short fruit-picking job for travel cash. It was a blip on most maps: grain silos, a weather-beaten gas station, a row of static-filled neon signs promising pie and coffee. On that particular morning, the plan was simple. I'd take a brief detour to visit an old family friend who owned a sheep ranch outside Red Valley, while Lisa wanted to stay in town and pick up a weekend gig at the local diner. There was no tension, just the unspoken understanding that adventure glitters brightest at the edge of the familiar. I recall Lisa pressing her pocket knife into my hand, a precaution passed around countless times between us, a little ceremony we repeated whenever one of us split off. "Promise me you'll call as soon as you get there," she said, and I grinned, promising as always to be careful. I set out alone for the highway, backpack comfortably heavy on my shoulders, boots crunching over sun-baked gravel. The morning was young, and everything felt charged with possibility. I scribbled the directions in my notebook. 2 rides east to Red Valley, then a quick walk to the ranch. The air was perfumed with wild sage, and for an instant, the world seemed impossibly wide but entirely within reach. Reaching the edge of town, I waited with my thumb out, a silent signal to passing motorists that I was hoping for a little road kindness. Eventually, a trucker pulled over, smiling behind mirrored aviators. "Where you headed, kiddo?" he called, and I explained my plan to get dropped off at a gas station outside Redford Highway. The stretch of road was quiet, punctuated only by the sound of cicadas. Just me, the highway, and the promise of adventure. It should have been just another ordinary side quest in a summer of movement and sunlight. Instead, Harper's Springs became a quiet fork in my journey, marking the last time my story remained in my own hands. Neither Lisa, waiting for my call, nor I, with my heart expectant and open, could have sensed the magnitude of what loomed just over the horizon. The last contact before disappearing. The final time I reached out to my loved ones was etched into my memory with a clarity that almost felt cruel in retrospect. It was barely after 9 in the morning when I stepped into the old squeaky phone booth on the outskirts of Redford, just beyond the cracked parking lot of a sun-bleached gas station. I had just gotten dropped off by the amiable trucker, feeling grateful but slightly rattled by the lonesome stretch of highway ahead. The town itself felt sleepy, as if holding its breath under the already warming sky. I remember the metallic taste of the change in my hand, the slight static on the line as I dialed home. My mom's voice crackled through, a tender mix of relief and motherly worry, as I assured her I was safe and that everything was going according to plan. We kept it brief. There was always an unspoken understanding that too much talking might make her more anxious. And besides, I didn't want to betray that shiver of nervousness curling in my stomach. I told her I loved her, promised to check in again before sundown. She reminded me to eat something real, to keep my pepper spray close, and to never, ever get complacent. I could practically imagine her clinging to the phone, pressing it tightly to her ear in our kitchen miles away, the morning sun just beginning to slant through our window at home. After the call, I slung my backpack over one shoulder and went into the convenience store attached to the station. There, the clerk, a middle-aged woman with thick black curls and cheerful eyes, smiled as I grabbed a bottle of water and a prepackaged sandwich. She made a casual comment about the weather, mentioning how quickly storms could sweep in from the west this time of year. I nodded, bought an extra granola bar just in case, and stepped back outside. The air felt heavy, sparking both a sense of adventure and an unexplained unease. Before trekking off toward the spot where I'd try to hitch my next ride, I paused, phone in hand. I nearly sent a text to Lisa that simply said, "Safe so far, see you soon." But something held me back. Maybe it was the whir of the highway, or how little my voice had actually helped my mom's nerves. Maybe I was just caught in that liminal space between confidence and the faintest shadow of fear. No one, my family, my best friend, not even me, knew that this little ritual of reassurance and routine would be the very last time anyone would hear my voice or trace my path. Every bit of it, from the scratchy phone call to the polite nod to the gas station clerk, became tinged with significance only after the world realized I had disappeared. And yet, in that moment, my world was still open, the road ahead stretching on in an endless invitation of possibility. Family reports to police and statewide search campaign. The hours after I failed to contact home grew thick with anxiety and uncertainty, a storm cloud settling over my family in Boulder. Back in our small sunlit kitchen where my siblings usually bickered over breakfast and my mother tried to keep chaos in check, a stark, cold silence took hold. My failure to call at dusk, as promised, was the sort of thing my family knew not to brush off. I was a wanderer, sure, but never careless with their trust. At first my mother tried to maintain her composure. She reasoned with herself that maybe I'd just missed the call window, that perhaps lack of cell coverage or a lost charger was to blame. But as darkness fell and there was still no word, panic threaded its way in like a toxin. My father, usually stoic and measured, dialed Lisa's parents, then every friend and acquaintance who might have had last contact with me. Lisa, herself just off her shift at the Harper's Springs diner, received the call with growing dread. We'd made pacts to check in, to never break the rhythm of reassurance, and Lisa knew with a certainty that bordered on instinct, something was wrong. The next step was the local police. My parents arrived at the small Boulder station late that night, exhaustion and worry etched in every movement. Filing a missing person report isn't as dramatic as the movies. There's paperwork, cautious questions, the subtle hint that runaways are more common than one might hope. But my parents, armed with a thick folder of my travel plans, a list of potential routes, the names of people I'd mentioned from the road, made their case with the fierce urgency only frightened parents can muster. Technically, the 60-odd hours since my last definite sighting in Redford made me a higher priority. The Boulder police flagged the case immediately to law enforcement in Wyoming, Nebraska, and especially Montana, where I was last believed to be. Multiple departments collaborated. It was no longer about one girl from Colorado, but a network spanning hundreds of small towns and miles of open country. The FBI was notified within 2 days, tagging my file for their missing persons bulletin. Meanwhile, my siblings helped in their own ways, setting up Facebook groups, sharing posts on social media, designing digital flyers with my image and a plea for any information. Each hour stretched into the next, bringing dread that felt physical, knotting itself into every meal, every conversation, every silent glance exchanged in my family's home. News spread fast. Boulder, despite its progressive quirks and college-town bustle, was still a place where everyone's business felt personal. Teachers and neighbors showed up at my family's door with casseroles and tearful support. Grandma Johnson drove in from Greenville, her sharp southern voice slicing through the well-meaning platitudes with calls for real action. My disappearance became a community crisis, missing person posters plastered on light poles, gas stations, and grocery stores. My high school put together prayer circles and distributed flyers at Friday night games. Lisa organized a volunteer phone bank to call highway motels and print shops all along our route. In Montana, the authorities were relentless. Search dogs combed the wheat fields outside Redford. Helicopters scanned the wooded valleys nearby, and dive teams swept the shallow creeks. Officers interviewed every clerk, trucker, diner waitress, and passerby who'd been in Harper's Springs or Redford the week I vanished. Hundreds of tips poured in, most useless, some heartbreaking, all checked nonetheless. People claimed to have seen me as far away as Spokane, Portland, even Salt Lake City. Every dead-end tip left my friends and family suspended between wild hope and mounting despair. The search expanded online. My story, a young woman vanished while hitchhiking cross-country, hit a chord. Internet forums began dissecting the timeline, where I was last seen, what I was wearing, what I might have carried. True crime communities, some motivated by genuine empathy, others by grim fascination, analyzed every photo and possible sighting. Hashtags with my name trended for days. Strangers called hotlines, emailed possible clues, and sometimes offered words of comfort to my parents and siblings. For my family, each new ping of an email or phone brought a rush of desperate hope, often followed by crushing disappointment. Lisa, meanwhile, retraced the last moments we'd shared together countless times. She pored over old texts, receipts, and directions we'd written by hand. The strain wore at her, at times hardening her into a resolute investigator, at others leaving her collapsed in tears on her bedroom floor. My absence, my sudden silence, reverberated through the lives I'd touched, a constant aching presence in every conversation and every sleepless night. The official investigation broadened and became more sophisticated. Regional media, then national news, aired my picture and story, focusing on the dangers of hitchhiking and the fears that grip any family facing a child's disappearance. FBI field agents coordinated with local law enforcement, dispatching forensic teams to Redford and Harper's Springs. Trucks and cars from security footage near the gas station where I was dropped off were painstakingly identified, their owners contacted and interviewed. Volunteer search parties swept both the wilderness and urban peripheries for weeks. Community centers became makeshift command posts. Support groups organized meals for the searchers, Every day, new volunteers arrived, strangers who knew my family only through the news or social media, driven by empathy and a kind of urgent need to help even in the face of growing futility. My family, suspended in a nightmare, found brief solace in these acts of solidarity, but could not help measuring hope against reality with each passing day. Days became weeks, media coverage started to wane, but the missing posters remained, weathering in the summer sun and autumn wind. My parents clung to routine as best they could, Dad going to the hardware store, Mom keeping the house, though neither was ever quite present. Detectives kept my family informed, but the answers were always the same. No confirmed sightings, no new evidence, no real leads. Eventually, the investigation slowed. Resources and attention faded, except for my family and a small circle of friends who refused to let my memory dissolve into another cold case statistic. Even as the search cooled, hope flickered on. My story continued to circulate in missing persons databases, my face resurfacing whenever another case or conversation about hitchhikers made the news. Friends of my family, some local, others from long past, sent postcards, poems, songs. My absence never let go. In quiet moments my family would swear they could still hear my laughter in the halls or see me on a distant street. Only those who've lost someone without explanation know the peculiar closeness of hope and heartbreak. Witnesses and fragile leads. The days following my disappearance stretched on, each sunrise drawing my family and law enforcement further into a mess of uncertainty. In these tense early weeks, the search for credible witnesses or concrete leads became an all-consuming mission, bordering at times on desperate obsession. News of my vanishing had already swept through the small towns along the Montana highway corridor, and brought a mosaic of would-be tips and witnessed fragments, some promising, others merely wishful thinking, but every single one scrutinized with a microscope's intensity. The first genuine thread came within a week. Dan, a long-haul truck driver, stepped forward after seeing one of the flyers my family distributed along the interstate. Dan recounted with clarity the ride he'd given a young woman matching my description: backpack, curly hair, faded jeans, and a turquoise pendant. He remembered my nervous politeness and how I'd asked to be dropped at a gas station on the outskirts of Redford. He recalled the way I thanked him, my smile a little wobbly, and how I had been careful in explaining my route without ever revealing too much. His memory drew a clear line. I'd left his truck at Redford around 9 a.m., heading north past the pumps into the sun-bleached morning. Other witnesses trickled in, each one painting my last known hours with stray brushstrokes. A convenience store clerk at the gas station, her hair crimped, voice warm, remembered selling me water and a granola bar. She noted my politeness, my stalling at the refrigerated drinks, scanning the parking lot with the anxious instinct of someone on the road alone. She remembered, too, how I had checked my phone, typed a message but appeared to hesitate before sending it, as if wrestling with some internal warning. A ranch hand from the neighboring property recounted seeing a girl, alone but not in distress, walking alongside the country road that snaked through the mountains outside Redford. She was lugging a teal backpack, her pace steady, even as afternoon heat rippled off the blacktop. The ranch hand's words echoed with uncertainty, because he couldn't recall precisely whether I'd been smiling or if there had been someone else trailing me at a distance. The sketchiest of clues, the one that would preoccupy investigators and haunt my family for months, was the recurring mention of a vehicle, a white SUV described by two separate residents of Redford as idling near the gas station that morning. One described it as barely 3 years old, spotless and expensive, the kind you wouldn't expect in such a rural pocket of the world. More telling, perhaps, was the detail that the driver, a man in his 40s, sat behind the wheel for over 20 minutes, engine running, sunglasses on, occasionally glancing at the gas station entrance. One local dog walker even claimed he saw the SUV pull off the shoulder just minutes after I was last spotted, heading onto the same road that wound toward the hills. Despite the urgency, law enforcement quickly discovered that leads burn out as easily as they flare up. The white SUV was, for days, the centerpiece of hope. Police officers canvassed nearby towns, pulled security camera footage from every highway-facing business, and questioned mechanics, tire shops, and anyone who might have serviced such a vehicle. Every SUV within a 50-mile radius seemed to be logged, checked, and ruled out or marked for further scrutiny, but nothing concrete emerged. Meanwhile, the community mobilized in ways both small and grand. My siblings took turns manning a volunteer hotline and scouring tip emails. Lisa retraced our maps for alternate routes and asked possible witnesses on local forums. My grandmother, her energy fierce despite her age, returned over and over to Redford handing out color flyers to every diner waitress, truck stop regular, and librarian she could find. The sense of frantic, searching motion, that something, anything might break, kept hope alive, even as days bled into weeks with no real breakthrough. In the silence that followed, rumors abounded and small-town gossip wove itself into the official record. Some said they'd seen a girl matching my description boarding a bus in Billings 2 days after I vanished. Others swore they saw someone walking on a remote stretch outside Missoula. One store owner reported selling a cheap rain poncho to a polite but distracted young woman who might have been me. Law enforcement, careful not to discount any possibility, chased every shadow. Each dead end was another small funeral of hope, painful, silent, and necessary. At the same time, the passage of time amplified the frailty of each clue. Initial sightings that once seemed promising now faded under scrutiny. Memories blurred. The trucker's ride was confirmed by fuel receipts and his GPS log, but the rest, glimpses of a turquoise pendant, a smile in a crowd, a girl hitching on the shoulder, remained intangible, almost ghostly. The longer I stayed missing, the more my story transformed. From a present emergency to a half-remembered cautionary tale whispered by truckers in roadside diners, or retold by mothers to their daughters leaving for college. The mounting wall of missing person flyers and news coverage brought both solace and ache to my family and friends. For every neighbor who hugged my mom and swore they'd keep looking, there were also strangers who speculated wildly on message boards or true crime podcasts, muddying timelines and chasing rumors. Officers faced relentless calls, sifting through tip lines, while investigators mapped a web of half-leads: the white SUV, a transient living in the woods, a traveling construction crew, even a runaway theory that I intentionally vanished, a theory that stung those who knew me deepest. Still, the smallest new detail became a reason to hang on. One afternoon, 2 weeks after my disappearance, a couple on a birdwatching trip reported hearing female voices arguing on a ridge not far from the highway where I was last seen. The area was combed by volunteers and K-9 units, but only found discarded candy wrappers, trampled wildflowers, and the echo of unanswered questions. Yet even this fleeting hope lured dozens more to join the search, stretching as far as the fields and abandoned mining roads where nobody had business wandering. Even Lisa, despite exhaustion, carried on, calling motels, tracking down records at bus stations, interviewing anyone who might have shared a stretch of road with me that week. She doggedly held to the idea that a story so common, girl hitchhiking, trusting, vanishing, deserved an ending with answers, not silence. But each new witness, each faint thread, was never enough. Like wind through prairie grass, the clues never quite took root. As July became August, law enforcement acknowledged, sometimes grimly, sometimes in tears with my family, that the trail was slipping beyond their reach. Absent physical evidence or a pivotal witness willing to step forward, all that remained were shadows. The white SUV, the kindly trucker, the gas station clerk, the ranch hand. Together, their stories formed a jigsaw puzzle missing too many pieces. Private investigators hired by my parents re-interviewed witnesses, dug through trash for scraps of evidence, and tailed every unfamiliar car on Redford's back roads. But the countryside kept its secrets. Each day without new evidence distanced the truth further, and my name slowly shifted from daily headlines to the quieter domain of long-shot missing persons cases. Still, those frail leads mattered. My family clung to each recollection, however vague, and each fleeting sighting as a reason not to surrender. My case, like so many, balanced on the edge between hope and resignation, a reminder that sometimes all that stands between knowing and not knowing are the memories and courage of a handful of strangers willing, against the odds, to speak up even when their words begin to fade. Suspects and stalled investigations. From the moment local law enforcement realized the gravity of my disappearance, their focus slowly tightened around the vast list of potential suspects. The early days of the investigation had been a frenzy of hope and motion, but as leads dwindled, the hunt became about following threads, some sturdy, most terribly thin, through the maze of possibility. The small-town character of Redford meant everyone knew, or thought they knew, most of their neighbors, which both helped and hampered the search. Familiarity made certain people above suspicion. At the same time, it sharpened the focus on those who didn't quite fit in, or had a shadowy reputation. The initial sweep produced 3 main persons of interest. The first was Mark, a local high school science teacher whose awkwardness around students had earned him jokes and, at times, whispered worry. Years prior, Mark had faced charges for a bar fight that escalated further than it should have, nothing sexual or violent by current standards, but enough to put his name in the official review pile. His alibi the morning I disappeared was solid. He'd been attending a teacher training workshop 2 towns over, a fact confirmed by multiple colleagues and event logs. Police questioned him closely, searching his property and his car, but found nothing more than a loner's clutter and textbooks from decades past. Then there was the drifter. Nearly every town along the Montana highway system has at least one transient, someone who holes up in a motel for a few days looking for odd jobs and leftover kindness. That summer, the most talked about outsider was a man in his late 30s known only as Caleb. Caleb had been spotted frequenting the edge-of-town truck stops, chatting up cashiers and occasionally helping farmers move hay bales for pocket money. He had a minor record, trespassing, public intoxication, nothing remotely connected to violence. Witnesses placed him in the area the week I vanished, but when police finally tracked him down, his timeline was patchy but consistent enough not to warrant further suspicion. He admitted to hitchhiking out of Redford the morning after I disappeared, a common enough act among drifters, and passed a voluntary polygraph test. His fingerprints, checked against anything found near the last place I was seen, produced no match. The third figure police scrutinized most intensely was Franklin, a mechanic who lived just beyond the town limits. Franklin's past was considerably darker than Mark's or Caleb's. Rumors abounded about him. He'd served jail time in his youth for burglary, and though he'd seemingly kept his nose clean in recent years, his name came up regularly when anything strange or wrong happened in the area. More critically, a decade-old sealed record linked him to an attempted assault in another county, never prosecuted, charges dropped for lack of evidence. When news broke of my disappearance, many in the community, especially wary parents, immediately suspected Franklin. Police questioned Franklin multiple times. His work records, cell phone logs, and interviews with coworkers were combed over by investigators. A search of his house and property was conducted with his wary, gruff consent. They found nothing conclusive beyond a locked shed filled with rusty car parts, old food wrappers, and the sad smell of stale beer. Forensic teams dusted his vehicles and shed for any trace evidence, but at the time, nothing that could be connected to my case turned up. When faced with questions, Franklin was uneasy, but not hostile. He maintained he'd spent the day at home repairing an outboard motor, and his neighbor, who mostly kept to herself, hesitantly corroborated his story. Even so, the sheriff's office kept returning, just in case a missing detail finally stuck out. Despite these leads, frustration grew palpable among law enforcement. As the days rolled onwards, the hard evidence simply never materialized. The initial surge of tips, interviews, and enthusiasm slowly ebbed into a quiet, gnawing sense of defeat. There were no footprints in the fields, no tire tracks leading to a secret spot, no items left behind except those that could have been mine, or anyone's. The town's collective anxiety began to curdle. Some whispered that the perpetrator must have been a total stranger, just passing through. Others were convinced that the answer lay buried within their own ranks. A chilling notion that left parents locking doors early and casting wary glances at neighbors they'd trusted for years. Tensions simmered at home too. My parents tried again and again to shake answers out of cold investigators. They wanted results, not pity. The lead detective, though compassionate, never shied from hard truths. The case had stalled. Redford, with its one cafe and handful of streets, started to feel like a place where silence pressed in around every corner, making it impossible for anyone, especially my family, to move on. My siblings clung to social media chatter, parsing every anonymous tip on Reddit and Facebook, their hope draining with each dead end. As weeks bled into months, the investigation took on an almost ritualistic rhythm. Re-interview old suspects, double-check timelines, interview anyone new to town or anyone who'd left abruptly. Police scoured pawn shops and junkyards for my belongings. My case file swelled with maps, timelines, and notes, but the absence of progress settled in like dust. The community, once united in purpose, grew suspicious and tired. Some blamed the police for incompetence, others accused the media of fueling gossip and hysteria. Meanwhile, investigators kept returning to Franklin, his shadowy reputation, the unease he inspired, the way he always seemed a little off-kilter at work or in the grocery store. Privately, officers debated whether they simply lacked the proof needed for a search more invasive than what had already been done. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence again and again, but there was nothing, no DNA, no fingerprints, no real break. For months, the list of suspects never really changed. nor did the gnawing conviction among some that the truth was agonizingly close, if only they could see what they were missing. If anything, that sense of helplessness was compounded by the sheer ordinariness of my route and routine. The road where I vanished was well traveled in daylight, and the townspeople, despite their quirks and old secrets, were mostly upstanding. This fact unsettled everyone. Cases like these weren't supposed to happen here. The authorities brought in outside experts. A veteran profiler from the FBI traced behavioral patterns in the interviews. Analysts from the state crime lab double-checked all traces from the vehicles and personal effects, but without a body, without any admissions, and without new evidence, every door stayed shut. As seasons changed and my case slipped further from public sight, the official investigation slowed to what even the most optimistic called a crawl. Mark was cleared, then Caleb. Franklin remained under a cloud, but with nothing to hold him. For my family and for Lisa, that reality was both a torment and a twisted comfort. At least the world still contained the possibility of answers, but for now, all they had was the ache of not knowing. The investigation, a labyrinth with no clear exit, became the background to our lives. A reminder that sometimes, in the face of heartbreak and uncertainty, even the most persistent searchers can only wait for the world to give up one of its secrets. New evidence surprisingly emerges after many years. The resurfacing of my case after so many silent years was nothing short of astonishing, both for my family and for the detectives who had long feared the truth would remain forever buried in the wheat fields near Redford. By 2014, 14 years had passed since that hot July morning I vanished. The world had largely moved on. Babies were born, photos faded on refrigerators, the diner in Harper's Springs changed owners twice. Yet for those who loved me, and for a handful of determined officers, the ache of unanswered questions had not dulled. My name still echoed across missing persons forums. My mother rotated fresh lilies beneath my high school graduation photo every anniversary. Much of the credit for the turn in my case goes to Iowa's Cold Case Unit, an eclectic team made up of seasoned detectives, passionate young forensics techs, and one former journalist who couldn't quite let go of these lost girls. Driven by a statewide initiative to re-examine cold cases, the group gathered files, photos, and evidence boxes in a repurposed police HQ office decorated with fading mugshots and coffee stains. Mine was not the only name on that wall, but as one detective later told my brother, it was the one he kept coming back to, late at night. The trigger for reopening my case came from a technology shift, rather than any new statement or lead. Advanced DNA methods, capable of extracting partial profiles from trace evidence, had become available, turning formerly dead-end hints into potentially game-changing clues. One of the cold case techs, Maribel Tran, was recataloguing evidence when she noticed on a checklist from the Redford PD that Franklin's truck seat hadn't been completely disassembled during its first search. Maribel requested the seat, still held in rural Montana storage, be shipped across state lines for meticulous re-examination. The seat arrived caked with a decade of dust, sun-bleached and still faintly smelling of gasoline. Working late into the night, Maribel donned gloves and began to carefully peel back fabric, pulling at faded seams and scraping along the creases. It took hours, but finally, a small, stubborn glint nestled deep beneath the passenger seat. A single silver and turquoise earring, dulled but unmistakable, the kind my sister used to tease me for wearing every day the summer I disappeared. Only I had bought a set like that, during a roadside pit stop in Cheyenne just days before everything changed. Even more telling, Maribel's careful swabbing revealed something nearly invisible to the naked eye. A strand of long curly hair wound around the earring's fastener, along with a smudge of what later testing would confirm was dried blood. Lab analysis, which once would have been impossible, now extracted mitochondrial DNA from the hair, matching it irrefutably to my mother's profile. The earring's design matched a piece my friend Lisa had described 3 times in tearful police interviews. It was, at last, a sliver of certainty, a material fragment of me, found where it never should have been. This discovery triggered a wave of procedural dominoes. The cold case team coordinated with Montana and Florida law enforcement. Franklin, the long-ago suspect whose name had been circled and crossed out 100 times on sticky notes, was now revealed to have relocated under a different name to the Gulf Coast. They quietly put him under surveillance, watching as he repaired cars by day and drank at weathered bars by night, seemingly haunted but living free. With the new evidence in hand, the cold case unit and the FBI, now officially involved due to state lines and the seriousness of the newly interpreted clues, secured a warrant for Franklin's DNA and a fresh search of his then-current dwelling. The ensuing days were tense. Coordination among agencies, the logistics of transporting critical evidence, and the gut-wrenching anticipation among my family, who had long ago learned not to get their hopes up, were palpable. The earring and genetic material tied the truck, and Franklin, to me in a way that could not be explained away by chance. For the first time, the legal pressure was finally on the right person. The impact was immediate. My family received the phone call they'd always known might come, but not like this, not with trembling clarity and sudden hope, but with disbelief too sharp to feel like relief. My mother, ever cautious even after all her heartbreak, asked Marybelle on the line to repeat herself, searching for cracks, for any chance this was another false dawn. But there weren't any. The earring was unmistakably mine, and the DNA was family. My brother drove overnight from Denver just to sit at my parents' kitchen table for the first update in years that was not just another apology. Investigators, meanwhile, began to reconstitute every thread that had ever tied Franklin to my case. His old Montana neighbors were re-questioned about his whereabouts the week I vanished. Former co-workers reluctantly remembered that Franklin had joked at the time about picking up pretty travelers along back roads. Too awkward, too vague to follow up on then, now shaded with a terrible clarity. Detectives chased down every friend, every credit card purchase, every old address, even as Franklin at first continued to insist on his innocence. Much of the breakthrough came from details that had once seemed dismissible. Franklin's out-of-state move had coincided almost precisely with the first waning of the investigation, a fact that, in hindsight, struck everyone as more than just a coincidence. When questioned again, he offered familiar practiced denials, but the circumstances had changed. He was no longer facing a community suspicion, but a direct and finally, scientifically backed confrontation. Experienced agents interviewed Franklin using techniques designed to probe for inconsistencies. Subtle shifts in his explanation, minor slips about dates, stilted responses to questions about his vehicle, gave agents enough cause to escalate the investigation. While these interrogations played out, my family was left at the edge of closure, not daring to hope for a body or a full confession, but clinging to the weight of undeniable physical evidence. My sisters, grown up now with families of their own, swapped anxious late-night calls. My father, long retired from his hardware store, paced his garden, letting the cicadas and the distant buzz of passing cars remind him of the last summer I'd been home. Even Lisa, now living out west and trying to put the past behind her, found herself drawn back in, haunted by memories but grateful at least that some part of the truth was within reach at last. In the background, the discovery made headlines again. News vans returned to Boulder and Montana. Stories aired about the persistence of cold case detectives, about the vulnerabilities of young travelers, and about the stunning way in which a single overlooked earring could unravel the silence of 14 years. Social media, which hadn't even existed the year I vanished, crackled with renewed discussion. My story trending, swirling between empathy, outrage, and the never-ending breathless urgency to know what happened next. For the first time in forever, the question was not, what if we never know, but what comes after? By the time Franklin was formally arrested, the network of agencies involved had shed years of frustration and inertia. It wasn't a dramatic takedown, but a meticulous operation, one last push in a case that had exhausted so much hope. FBI agents moved quietly in before dawn, putting Franklin in handcuffs outside of his modest rental house in Florida. News broke within minutes, and by afternoon, both local and national media were carrying updates. His mugshot, pale, older, eyes haunted, became a symbol of the justice so many families longed for but so rarely received. For law enforcement, the work was only beginning. Detectives started combing through every property Franklin had owned or worked on, from the remote Montana shed to Florida garages. Old evidence boxes were pulled from storage, and detectives worked overtime with forensic teams to try to establish definitively whether Franklin had told anyone about my disappearance or left behind any trace of me. Cadaver dogs were brought to search locations once considered cleared. Workshops, shallow grave sites, long-forgotten outbuildings were revisited with fresh urgency. Franklin's digital footprint was scoured for any hints he might have communicated online with other victims, or kept records of his crimes. Meanwhile, the emotional ripple spread far beyond my family. Neighbors from my old town, who'd grown used to living in the shadow of my disappearance, mourned both the loss and the many years of uncertainty. The cold case team received letters from families across the country, parents of missing children, former runaways and even other survivors, telling them that this small breakthrough meant the world to people who feared nobody ever looked twice at their pain. My story became a case study among detectives and forensic scientists alike, a testament to the power of persistence, and to what can be achieved when science is finally allowed to fill in the empty places left by memory and rumor. The trial ahead would not be easy. Even with scientific evidence, many facts would remain forever lost. But in turning over that last, overlooked artifact, in pulling a fragment of my life from beneath a rusty car seat, the distance between those final moments and the rest of the world shrank, just a little. 14 years had passed, but with the discovery of a single earring and the dedication of strangers unwilling to let go, my story, at last, had a real chance at an ending. DNA analysis and the breakthrough in solving the case. For years, the box of evidence from my disappearance sat quietly in a Montana storage locker, gathering dust as seasons changed and hope slowly dimmed. No one, not even the most devoted cold case detective, could have imagined that a technology unavailable in 2000 would decades later become the catalyst for a seismic change in my story. But that's exactly what happened when advanced forensic DNA analysis emerged, offering families like mine a glimmer of hope that science might speak where memory and rumor could not. The DNA breakthrough began, as it often does, with tiny details. The single turquoise earring found under Franklin's dusty truck seat was carefully bagged and cataloged back in the early investigation, but nobody had the means at that time to extract more than a basic fingerprint test, which led nowhere. It wasn't until the cold case unit, in cooperation with the newly formed forensic DNA lab, decided to revisit every scrap of evidence that the earring became central, a stubborn sliver of my life refusing to dissolve into the past. Each step of the DNA process felt like watching a slow, high-stakes magic trick unfold. The old earring was peeled from its plastic bag, still marked Hailey Johnson, possible link. Scientists in white coats and gloves set to work, swabbing the back for skin cells, picking off the single long hair entangled in the fastener, meticulously scraping the minute stain they hoped might yield dried blood. It's almost funny in a cosmic way, how a piece of jewelry, once chosen on a whim at a roadside stand, could end up being the fulcrum on which a whole justice system pivots. The first test was mitochondrial DNA extraction from the hair, a painstaking process requiring both patience and a touch of luck. A staff scientist maintained late-night vigil in the lab, running machine after machine until finally the sequencer produced a match. The hair belonged to the daughter of Susan Johnson, my mother, whose DNA sample had quietly sat in a government freezer since the early days of my missing person file. A second, even more advanced analysis was performed on the fleck of blood found within the earring clasp. This time, with powerful polymerase chain reaction, PCR, the team was able to amplify the genetic material enough to produce a full profile that left no room for doubt. The news that the sample matched both the maternal line and my original childhood DNA, extracted from a baby tooth the family had almost thrown out years ago, struck the cold case squad like a thunderbolt. Suddenly, 14 years of speculation snapped into focus. I was in that truck. The earring was mine. The evidence irrefutable. In one lab report, the dream of closure was suddenly breathtakingly legitimate. With the DNA results in hand, law enforcement knew their window was opening. A crime committed almost a generation earlier was about to answer to modern forensics. Coordination began immediately. Montana authorities, the state crime lab, and the FBI all choreographed each step to ensure Franklin could not slip away. Privately, agents knew that DNA alone might not tell the whole story. There had never been a full confession, nor a final resting place located, but in American law, DNA evidence has become the gold standard, and for families living in long darkness, nothing offers more hope. The warrant to apprehend Franklin came together with unprecedented speed. New search orders covered every residence and property he'd owned, from Montana to Florida, while court orders compelled him to submit hair and blood samples. The media was kept in the dark for the first 48 hours, officers hoping this element of surprise would prevent any attempt at flight or destruction of further evidence. When FBI agents finally arrived at his Florida address in the humid pre-dawn, the mood was tense but determined. This was no routine arrest. It was the bookend to a mystery that had haunted a family, a community, and everyone who'd ever traveled those lonely western roads. Behind the scenes, the science continued. Every item salvaged from Franklin's life was inspected, Pieces of duct tape, work gloves, random receipts from the summer of 2000, even dust samples pulled from cracks in his old garage. The goal was to stack the mountain of physical evidence just as high as the emotional certainty shared by my family. The earring and DNA became cornerstones, around which prosecutors constructed the most indisputable narrative possible. In the weeks that followed, prosecutors met with my family, detectives, and forensic experts in marathon sessions, outlining the case's strengths and the few remaining gaps. The DNA evidence, though it could never speak the whole truth of what happened that day, at last provided the irrefutable link the case had been so desperately missing. Days before the grand jury convened, the prosecutor handling my file quietly told my mother that the science had given them something no hopeful flyer or grainy security footage ever could: absolute specificity, and with it, justice. For my family, the moment they learned about the DNA breakthrough is carved into memory more vividly than birthdays or anniversaries. The detective, his voice strained, pitched somewhere between hope and caution, called the house one crisp autumn afternoon. My mother put the call on speaker so my remaining siblings could hear. "We have something," he said, "something definitive." There was a hush, broken only by the faint sounds of my dad's pacing, the shudder in my sister's breath, the click of my mother's pen as she scribbled notes out of habit more than need. They tried to process the implications. Justice had seemed out of reach for so long that its sudden nearness felt surreal, almost frightening. My little brother, now grown, admitted later that he broke down when the detective explained how modern science had caught up with a case everyone else had long labeled hopeless. The family attorney, who'd seen too many cold cases turn fruitless, called the evidence a miracle, at least as close as mortals get. For the investigators, this new technology and outcome meant more than closing a file. It meant that all those years spent rerunning interviews, chasing rumors about white SUVs, and diagramming timelines on whiteboards weren't for nothing. It was validation, proof that the pursuit of truth, even when it takes years, can still be rewarded in the unlikeliest ways. In departmental meetings, the case became the new benchmark for why even the smallest scrap of evidence must be preserved, why every cold case deserves one more look. The legal process accelerated with a sense of finality. For the prosecution, the DNA evidence was the seismic shift required to overcome Franklin's history of denial and circumstantial alibis. Armed with this indisputable physical proof, they were able to secure not only the arrest, but support for charges that could hold, even without a body, even after all that time. The standards around no-body homicide prosecutions are exacting in American law. They require not just circumstantial narrative but scientific certainty. The DNA on my earring, in Franklin's truck, offered that certainty. What the DNA could never provide, though, were the answers my family most wanted. What exactly happened in those lost hours, where my final resting place was, whether I knew, if only in my last moments, that people loved me desperately and never stopped searching. Still, to them, to Lisa, and to the cold case unit, this new chapter was both promise and closure. Technology had illuminated the path when everything else had failed. It's a strange comfort to know that in some mysterious mathematical way, a part of me survived, hanging on as evidence until the world was finally ready to listen. Testimony, trial, and the truth gradually revealed. The trial that followed the arrest of Franklin wasn't just a legal process, it was a patchwork reckoning involving years of grief, bursts of hope, and the stubborn persistence of everyone who had never allowed my disappearance to fade into silence. The courtroom felt almost impossibly small compared to the scale of our loss and the vastness of the years gone by. Every seat was claimed by family, old friends, law enforcement officers who'd carried the file through shifts and promotions, and even strangers who'd followed my case for over a decade. There was an electricity in the air, taut with longing for closure yet shadowed by all that could never be reclaimed. Franklin entered the proceedings stone-faced and heavy-shouldered, escorted by 2 deputies. Early on, his attorney rattled off familiar phrases: innocent until proven guilty, gaps in the physical evidence, the tragedy of a missing girl whose story had become half rumor, half myth. But the prosecution, armed with the DNA from my earring, timelines reconstructed with unheard-of diligence, and painstakingly cross-verified witness testimony, laid the table for what would become a transformative trial in the region's history. It wasn't just the cold precision of science that held the courtroom in thrall. It was the way voices shook with memory, Lisa, my best friend, recalled our last hug at Harper's Springs and identified in tears the turquoise earring she'd seen 1,000 times. My little brother, now a grown man, recounted how he'd kept calling my number for months, letting the phone ring just to hear my voice message. My mother, every line of her face traced with missing years, told the jury how she'd woken up every night expecting to hear the door squeak and my backpack hit the hallway floor. The prosecution never tried to disguise the lack of a body. They let the evidence and emotion work together deliberately, knowing that what was irrefutable was enough for justice. The defense pressed back hard. They questioned the potential for contamination of the evidence, suggested alternative suspects, referenced Franklin's earlier cooperation with police, and tried to exploit gaps inherent in a case decided so long after the fact. But the scientific testimony landed with force. Forensic experts described in compellingly clear terms the uniqueness of the DNA matches, the statistical impossibility of error, and the process that ensured evidence integrity even after 14 years on a dusty shelf. One testimony in particular, that of Maribel Tran, the cold case technician, was unforgettable. She outlined step by step how she'd traced and flagged the overlooked truck seat, her voice calm yet shimmering with the gravity of what she'd discovered. Franklin's demeanor shifted over the course of the trial. At first remote, almost a prop in his own drama, he became visibly agitated as the weight of evidence and memory pressed in. It was during cross-examination that cracks first appeared, inconsistencies about his whereabouts, changes in the tenor of how he described his actions that day, a momentary hesitation that the prosecutor seized on, threading it back to the circumstantial evidence in a way that left little doubt. It was never cinematic, a single wrenching confession, but a gradual, reluctant crumbling. The most resonant moment for all present was Franklin's own testimony. Facing weeks of mounting proof and his own past catching up with him, he at last, haltingly, admitted to picking me up that morning, corroborating details that only the perpetrator could have known. His motives, his decision to silence a hitchhiker whose memory refused to let go, and his calculated departure from the small town after were laid bare. Chillingly, he described feeling watched every time he saw a missing poster or heard my name whispered in church or at the feed store. Regret flickered across his face, but it was thin and unconvincing, and for my family, no more than a ghost of what he owed. The legal process unfolded in draining, granular detail. Jury selection spotlighted the town's anguish. So many locals harbored memories or opinions about the case that impartiality became difficult to guarantee, and several alternates were called in from neighboring counties. Personal accounts accumulated. Former classmates, my siblings, even residents of Redford wanting to counter the stigma of a killer among them, all took the stand. The trial was both catharsis and community reckoning, healing for some, reopening wounds for everyone. Media attention peaked. Reporters filled every aisle, their stories carrying the case beyond the Rockies to the national stage, spotlighting not only the breakthrough of cold case DNA but the vulnerabilities and overlooked stories of missing women in America. True crime podcasts, daytime news shows, and comment sections all pulsed with debate. Some hailed the investigators as heroes, others questioned why it took so long, and a few, unhelpfully, spun theories about accomplices or deeper cover-ups. My family largely tuned this out, huddling together each night after court, sharing exhausted meals, bracing for yet more testimony in the days ahead. Each day, the trial seemed to inch everyone a step closer to the truth, not only about my disappearance but about the shadows that can fall over quiet towns. Legal precedent became part of the narrative. This was the rare case where conviction hinged on circumstantial evidence aided by DNA but without the closure a body normally brings. Prosecutors pushed for the maximum penalty, knowing Franklin's history and the agony his silence had visited on those left, searching for far too long. After closing statements, haunted by photographs, timelines, and the small turquoise earring in an evidence bag, the jury deliberated for hours that felt like days. When they returned a verdict of guilty, the courtroom held its breath. My mother wept openly for the first time in years. My siblings gripped the rail so hard their knuckles whitened. Franklin's fate was sealed, life without parole, in accordance with new laws recognizing the unique cruelty of murder cases where bodies remain missing. But vindication was never a clean or total thing. The sentence came with a hollow echo, a testament to the persistence of truth, yes, but also a stark reminder of absence that would never be resolved. My family, in the aftermath, turned to each other and to the rituals they'd built to remember me, Annual gatherings, silent prayers, the old graduation photo above the mantel. Even as the headlines faded, the courtroom transcripts stored away, and Franklin began his sentence, the search for answers went on in smaller, quieter ways, sometimes in conversation, sometimes in the dreams that never quite let them go. The trial closed a chapter that had stretched agonizingly over nearly 2 decades. My story was entered into the record not only as a cautionary tale, but as a rallying cry for persistence, improved forensic science, and the unyielding demand for justice even when the odds seemed insurmountable. And though the final facts emerged slowly, painfully, there was a peace found in naming them out loud, in refusing, even after all those years, to let silence have the last word. The case closes, the pain remains open. Even when the last gavel fell and the case was officially marked closed in the county records, nothing about the aftermath felt final for my family or the community that had carried fragments of my absence for nearly 2 decades. What justice offered in certainty, it could not give back in comfort, and the legal closure illuminated the rawness of wounds left to echo in everyday life long after the headlines faded. In a way, the trial and conviction provided only a new mode of grieving. There was relief, of course, a deep and trembling gratitude that the search was over, that Franklin, whose presence had haunted so many sleepless nights, would never again harm another soul. But in the quiet after, a strange hollowness settled in our home, one that years of wondering and ceaseless hope had once hidden from view. The rituals of remembering, lighting a candle beneath my picture, gathering for annual memorials, continued as always, only now the question swirling around them had shifted. Not where is she, but how do we live with what we know? For my parents, the answer remains elusive. My mother, so long defined by an alternating current of action and waiting, now kept herself busy in other ways. She started tending rose bushes in the backyard with almost devotional patience, hands caked in soil as though to ground herself in something green and growing when the world felt so irrevocably pruned. Friends still visited, sometimes in ones and twos, bringing casseroles and sympathy, but over time visits grew shorter, sadness less sharp, and a quiet understanding emerged that there are places inside grief that can never be shared. My father, who once managed the bustle of a family hardware store with steady hands, struggled to turn that organizational skill toward healing. He boxed up my childhood things, notes, mismatched earrings, a half-filled notebook of travel plans, and stored them away in the attic, unable to throw anything out, irrationally fearful that even the smallest relic might contain some echo of my voice. The house sometimes felt haunted not by me, but by the sudden immense hush left in the wake of answers no one wanted. My siblings, grown and scattered across the country, called each other more often for a time. Group texts would briefly swirl with stories and shared coping strategies. One took up running, burning grief off by mile. Another leaned into community volunteer work, trying to give to others what she could no longer give to me. My younger brother, whose childhood was shaped by the shadow of a missing sister, finally started telling his new family about who I had been. Each of them, in their own way, contended with the complicated weight of having reached the end of a story with so many chapters forever unwritten. Lisa, the friend whose life had twined most tightly with mine, struggled the longest to lay down her own particular brand of guilt. For years, she carried the burden of being the last familiar face to see me, replaying every word and gesture of our final day together, as if she might find the one choice that could have changed everything. The conviction helped ease her self-blame, but did not erase it. She began to speak to local high schoolers about the risks she and I once gambled, a kind of public mourning braided with activism, in hopes that telling the truth about our dreams and our mistakes might send someone else safely home. The broader community too was changed in ways both obvious and subtle. Redford and Boulder, once joined by nothing but a highway and a handful of police reports, became bound together in the collective lore of my disappearance and discovery. For a season after the trial, churches and libraries held forums on missing persons, and the habits of generations shifted. Parents discouraged hitchhiking, neighbors kept closer tabs on newcomers, Rotary clubs raised money for Amber Alert systems and roadside signage. My case, and the eventual closure, became both a memorial and a marker of communal anxiety. Some townsfolk resented this and wished for the days when such tragedies belonged only to crime novels or city news. Others regarded it as a necessary reckoning, one that forced a consideration of just how fragile safety can be, even on the sunniest of main streets. Still, beneath all that practical aftermath, a gnawing ache lingered. Closure in a criminal sense didn't bring me home. There were no remains to bury, no gravesite where flowers and memories could entwine. The absence endured, becoming not just the space I left behind, but a presence unto itself. My mother would sometimes swear late at night that she heard the footfall of a girl coming home, or saw a shadow move across the far end of the driveway. My father, in dreams, still talked with me about the weather, the Rockies, highway songs. Upon waking, the ache found him anew, sharper for the lines and years it had traveled. Media attention dwindled as it always does. The reporters and podcasters who once hounded the family for sound bites drifted off toward fresher heartbreaks and mysteries. The missing person flyers curled in the wind and one by one disappeared from lampposts and grocery store windows. Every so often my story would make an appearance on an anniversary, or in an article about lost girls, or the advances of forensic technology. More often it was whispered in the jangled nerves of parents whose children asked to hike or travel alone, a cautionary tale that carried the weight of thousands of other stories like mine, still waiting for closure. In legal circles, my case became a precedent, an unusual but powerful proof that no body homicide convictions could succeed where science, patience, and a relentless community refused to let go. Prosecutors from other counties called my family's attorney for insight. Cold case investigators reevaluated old files, inspired by what one earring and a fleck of DNA had achieved for mine. There was pride in that, a kind of grim hope, but also a surreal sense that my life had become not just memory but an object lesson, a warning, and at best an argument for change. Years on, the family's pain transformed, but never shrank. Anniversaries still brought rawness to the surface. My birthday each November, the date of my disappearance each July, graduations, weddings, and the small, ordinary moments in which my absence was a ghost at every table. My siblings would sometimes pause, mid-conversation, struck by the instinct to call and tell me something funny or beautiful, only to remember there was no number to dial. My mother's roses grew thick and riotous some years, as if in defiance of what had been lost, and neighbors said the blooms seemed to hold color longer than any others on the block. As for me, the person whose story spun out into so many others' suffering and courage, the closest thing to a legacy came not from closure, but from the way people kept remembering and speaking my name. My town, which once seemed to vanish in the expanse of America, now held a tiny commemorative plaque near the edge of the old hardware store, in memory of Hailey Johnson, who loved the road and whose journey changed us all. Students from my high school took part in an annual walk for missing persons each spring, and sometimes in late summer, strangers would come from miles away to tend the roses with my mother, listening as she told stories of all the things I dreamed of seeing and being before the world turned dark. Ultimately, the case's formal ending marked only the start of a different, quieter kind of struggle. Grief remained, woven into my family's days, an ache dulled by time but never resolved. For those left behind, closure wasn't so much an end as an invitation to remember without the urgent, desperate chase for answers. Love persisted, stitched together by those who kept searching, who built gardens and memories from the ruins of hope. My story, like the stories of too many whose cases once turned cold, lived on not simply as a caution, but as a stubborn ember, a reminder that every loss leaves a mark, every answer costs something, and some wounds can be tended, but never truly closed.